So the first speaker after the break now is Llewelyn from Oxfordshire County Council, who's responsible for infrastructure, innovation and development, and he'll give us a county perspective on the issues we've discussed and the sort of modelling implications of that. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to give I suppose I'm not a transport modeller, I will confess to that, but I've ended up having been involved in transport modelling for about the last 15 years, as I seem to be the last person to step backwards when they say go and develop a new transport model. But so this is giving a perspective of Oxfordshire and Oxford, touched on some of the work that we've done to date and the approaches we've taken, but also it's really about putting out the challenge out there to industry of what we're trying to tackle and what are the opportunities. So yeah, Oxfordshire, our big challenge at the moment is growth. It's a good thing. We've got a target of 100,000 homes to 2031, 85,000 jobs, as you can see. The really interesting thing is we're meeting our jobs target. We're actually exceeding it. The other interesting thing, we are not anywhere near meeting our homes target, which is really, as you will know from being in the transport profession, really putting pressure on the transport network. Anyone who's driven through Oxfordshire in the peak will know you don't really drive through Oxfordshire, you just sort of slowly join the back of a queue and hopefully get to the end of it at some point. But we are lucky, we've had big rail investment, new rail service that will open from Oxford through to Marylebone next month. It's been running from Oxford Parkway in the north of Oxford at the moment. And there is lots of support for East West Rail, which will hopefully give us connections across to Milton Keynes, Bedford, and hopefully one day Cambridge. So we are getting some investment and some alternative modes. Now, our tool for modelling this growth has been a Satyr model. We had to quickly update our Satyr model a few years ago. At the time, lots of new data sources were coming out, and I took the decision to ask the market to see if we could use these new data sources to develop the transport models, to do something differently. So we specifically put in a request for people to look at the new data sources. We did a wide tender, and thankfully, Anand, who's sitting over there, someone came back and said, I think we can do this. And he developed the first county-wide strategic Satyr model that used mobile phone data. And we were the first to do this. We had lots of interesting discussions with the likes of INRIX of buying mobile phone data. The interesting thing is, at the time, being the first didn't really save us money because we got there was only one person to go to ask for mobile phone data. But what it did do is really save on the annoyance of roadside interviews. So instead of having 50 plus roadside interviews we'd have normally had, we had 3, which was really to validate previous origin and destination information from our last model. So it really meant that it didn't annoy any of our members, so we managed to build it without them really knowing about it, which is a good thing. But it's not great for everything. And one of the big issues is with growth, it's got to tackle major development, major schemes, and also tackle how do we plan for future growth, so how do we support local plan development. In Oxfordshire, we're still trying to define where the growth that you can't fit in Oxford goes. So the scenarios around all the different local plans changes constantly, which then puts more issues onto the Satyr modelling. Particularly if you're trying to do one local plan in the west of Oxfordshire and you don't actually know where the other growth, the other 10,000 houses are going, which does have a bit of an impact on the trip rates and the trip patterns of the west of Oxfordshire. So we've worked really well with Atkins in trying to get through those issues, but it shows Saturn is quite a clunky tool for trying to do things quickly and iteratively when we've done the best we can. This sort of gives us some of the ideas of the increased trip that we're going to get into and around Oxford and some of the things we're managing and the challenges we've got. Now, moving on to a couple of years ago, we had the challenge of the Westgate Centre, which is the big shopping centre in the city centre, closing down and taking away the car parking. At this point, we thought it was a good idea to start trying to think of the problem of how do we think about transport mobility in a different way, how do we tackle this problem? How are people going to get in and out of the city centre? And when it reopens in the autumn this year, they're expecting 5 million extra visitors, but still only 800 car parking spaces. So there's definitely a need to get people into the city in a different way. We developed a collaboration with both universities and a group of SMEs, and they're from different sectors. So they came from the F1 sector, marketing and infrastructure sectors. And we started looking at this problem in a different way. And what this did is start to really get down to use case analysis. So we basically did I suppose coming from a top-down approach with looking at the data, how do things work and how does the system work, we actually started to look at how does the people use the system. And what this really, what we found is at the beginning we thought we'd have massive gaps in data. What we found is we've actually got quite a lot of information and data. We don't always use it. We don't always understand it that well. And the big area and gaps in information we do have is actually the experience, the customer, the person using the city. So we did the Transport Studies unit at the university, did a lot of use case analysis and worked with user groups. And it found really key big problems like the reason why people don't use the park and rides is there isn't a toilet in some of them. And why aren't people cycling in certain places? Because there isn't any places to park your bike. So it's not always a massive, big piece of infrastructure that will solve a problem. It's simple things. The other thing was integrated ticketing, but that comes up all the time, and it still comes up as a big issue. But what this meant for us was actually thinking about a problem in a different way. And what came out of this was we set up the group as something called Mobox. It's a community interest company. And it's been really important in allowing us to talk to a wide range of stakeholders from different peoples of interest to look at problems in a different way. And this it's sort of informed our Oxford transport strategy, and that's really Oxford transport strategy on a single page. We want to move from the right-hand picture to the left-hand picture because we have no capacity. And it's also supporting continued research in this area. So we've already funded 2 PhD students. One's looking at agent-based modelling, so trying to how do you go from understanding the user approach to modelling that. And the other one's looking at junction modelling around and integration with autonomous vehicles. So we're starting to develop this a bit further, and it's really informed the way we think of problems. I mean, another area that we're lucky to have in Oxford, we have Oxfordshire. We've been working with them for a couple of years, since they established, really. And what we're really keen to look at is how to integrate the information that comes out of their vehicles. So this is the LiDAR information that you get back. It's much better. They've managed to get much better resolution in these pictures now. But can we create a virtual, a BIM, a real-world BIM model? So we're working with them to see if we get this information, can we work with someone from the other side to create a real-world BIM model that we could actually use, which would help with network asset management, but also when we're developing schemes, can we go in and actually really have a real-world impact of what a scheme might look like? We're also looking at AVs. I mean, this has been pointed out a lot today. What is the impact? I mean, I know some of the early modelling that John Miles did with the Automotive Council said if we get up to, I think it's around 56% of autonomous vehicles, you're looking at least 25% increase in capacity. I think that's an underestimate potentially in the strategic network. But the real issue for us is what happens when you get autonomous vehicles into the city. So the challenge for us is there isn't any space. We don't think there's any space, and we've been struggling with the challenge of single occupancy vehicles, and we're trying to think about how do you manage zero occupancy vehicles and what policies and regulations you need around that. One of the challenges before we even get to autonomous vehicles, we have shared space in Oxford. This is Queen Street, and we have buses that mingle in with pedestrians. So this was done. There was no real. We did various models before this went in, but it was effectively took some brave members to approve it. Now we have another decision with the Westgate. It's just in the background opening, and the increase in visitor numbers. There's been a pressure to close this off completely now with buses. So we've had to make a decision at the moment, but we haven't been able to model this. So we're making a decision. It's potentially a temporary decision, so we're going to close it and see what happens. and which is probably as good a way of doing it as anything. But it obviously caused disturbance for the bus operators that aren't particularly happy. There are some members of the public aren't happy because it increases the distance between stops. But we think at the moment, looking at the figures of pedestrians and the numbers of buses, it's the only thing we can do, and we will monitor it and see whether we can introduce a different number of vehicles through that area in the future. But what we did find is there's no simple tool we can go to test, see if we can get people a bit more information to make their decision. We've got ambitions to pedestrianise a lot more of the city. So the challenge for us is, can you put autonomous vehicles into parts of these pedestrianised parts of the city? Because as you pedestrianise the city, the gaps between the edges of the city become quite big distances. We want people to move around the city. So that's a challenge that we're looking at. The good thing is, partly off the back of the work with Mobox and setting up a research and innovation team that's integral to our transport planning services, it's only a small team, and it's been hidden for a few years, so you have to hide the teams away from cuts. But we've started to get some good projects through now, so they're allowed to come out of the dark now. But from the work that we've been doing for the last couple of years, we've started to get access to a lot more new data sources. Now, we don't necessarily have all the skills internally to understand what we can do with these data sources. Us, like a lot of other authorities, got rid of our modelers. They were part of cuts way before I was around, and a lot of the data analytics skills just aren't in local authorities. So that's why things like Mobox collaborations are so important, because we understand we are not necessarily the best people to understand what we can do with the data, but we're getting access to it. So we're part of the Google Better Cities project. We've had access to Google data. It's their mobility data. It goes back 2 years. If there's a link on this, it takes you to, it's on the Google Policy Europe page, but it gives you an idea of what they did in Amsterdam before they started working with us and TfL, I think. What they found was they were able to use their data, put it through machine learning, and it started to give you as good an output as physical sensors on the ring road network of Amsterdam. That was very interesting to us. So we're looking at whether we can whether it gives us the potential, this real-time data gives us the potential of active network management in the key corridors. Is it a way of giving us virtual bus priority? We'll try it again. We've tried it before with things like Scoot, and they haven't worked. But maybe this is an answer. Who knows? At the moment, our only person working on this is our PhD student. So invest in PhD students. They're useful sources. Also, we have collaborations with the Oxford Internet Institute. They're doing a lot of work around new sources of data and how these new sources of data can be used for making policy decisions in cities. So there's 2 projects. Nexus, this is a European project, and Urban Data to Decide. This was their first attempt at just gathering Twitter data and mapping the origin and destinations. And as a sort of heat map of movement, it's pretty good. If you start to get down to the detailed, it's way off. So we have a real skew of Oxford to Westminster, which is probably our leader tweeting in Westminster when he's there. But as a heat map, it's pretty good. It gives you a good idea. If you put that against our journey to work movement, it does overlay quite well. So it was interesting to work with them to start to look at these different data sources that we've not considered before. We've also just signed up an agreement with Waze, part of their Connected Cities programme. This is something that's come out from Esri for their ArcGIS systems, but it's an analytics tool that you can use. So the good thing is the industry is starting to respond with simple tools. This is what we want. This is what I want for offices, is simple tools for them to use to analyse data at a high level, and then the detail to happen below from industry and experts and PhD students. So this is a useful tool. This maps all the data that the Waze feeds will give a city. It's mostly incident data if anyone's used Waze. What's really interesting is Waze allow us to keep the data, so we can aggregate this data over a long, long time if we can get some storage space, cloud storage or whatever, and you can start to do heat maps of issues. So this is one for New York. We hope to be able to use this soon, as we are moving to ArcGIS, which is a happy coincidence. It was not planned. But you can start to see, here's another data source. So this is really good for accident analysis, but also we have speed data that comes out of the Waze. So you can start to see how this will inform more traditional transport modelling tools, potentially. This is probably one of our most exciting projects that we're doing at the moment. This is with a company called Zipabout. I will say that if you want more details of how this actually works, Daniel is in the audience, and I'll refer most of the questions to him. But we've been working with Zipabout for a couple of years. We got introduced by the Transport Catapult to do a bid. We didn't win that bid, but their concept of what they wanted to do was so interesting. We've carried on working with them and helped to facilitate a much bigger collaboration. So within Oxfordshire, we've got a collaboration of all the transport operators, the major business parks, County Council, Mobox are part of it, universities, lots of numerous parties. We're trying to get land securities now, the main retail development as well, involved. So we've built that collaboration over time, and what this is going to be is a mobility journey PA. So a personalised journey planner, a proper personalised journey planner that's tailored to the individual. And we really think this is a building block for mobility as a service in Oxfordshire. And we think we've got a chance of doing it. I think Oxford the UK in a deregulated environment is a hard place to do this. I mean, it's great what Helsinki have done, but if you go out and say you must do mobility as a service and you have the ability to tell all the operators to do that, it's relatively easy to do that. In Oxfordshire, where we have a very successful multi-operator network, it's a bit harder. It's hard enough just getting integrated ticketing. But we think there's a chance in Oxfordshire. We think there's a chance, and we hope. It's definitely our ambition. And we think this is the building block to do this. The other thing that working with Zipabout is we've started to work with them to develop the platform that would face the local government. So again, it's developing simple tools for officers to use to make high-level decisions and point them in the right direction before we get down to the detail analysis. So it uses multiple sources of data, live feeds from our UTC, live feeds from the rail, environmental data, human behaviour data, sentiment analysis. They've got historical data, so when it gets up and running, it will actually understand the network to some extent and will carry on learning. And they've got machine learning behind all of this. And the good thing is they come from a marketing background, so they come from a background of understanding user behaviour. So we really think this will work. And that's just some of the example of the loads they put into the machine to the platform at the moment. As you can see, there's lots of different data sources going into it. Lots of tweets and Facebook interactions. And this helps to give you a slightly better understanding of what's happening on the network, particularly with things like buses, where the real-time information is not always the greatest in terms of knowing where the buses are and what they're doing around the city. So it's really useful for us as well. So I've nearly done it. So moving on to our next opportunity and the other challenge of modelling. We're lucky in that we've got Culham in the county. And at Culham we have recently had the remote application to controlled environment building built. So I call this robots in dangerous places. So it's specialised and built for robotics in the nuclear industry. But what we've worked out over the last couple of years is why keep those specialists within the nuclear industry? So we've developed the idea now that Culham should be much more of a living lab. Initially we're looking at AV and robotics, but actually it's around smart cities. So it's a real-world living lab for smart cities, and Culham's a really interesting site. It has 2,000 people work on it. It has 10 kilometres road network, but it's a closed site, secure site. So there's a lot you can do on it. And Oxbotica moved into the race building, and if you talk to Oxbotica, that moving into the race building has allowed them to develop their technology quickly because they've been able to drive it around real roads, pretend to run over people, and do it in a quiet environment, an environment where they know there aren't too many competitors on there, and the people aren't too likely to start, looking at their vehicles. So they've managed to iterate really quickly there. So we've developed this to a broader scope to look at smart cities. So we're interested in drones, use of drones, 5G technology. But what's really interesting with Culham, if it works, is Culham's also got planning permission to build a housing development next to it. So we want... it's not going to play, is it? There's a video that goes with this. It's very good. Oh, it's going to go. So yeah, so we're looking at developing the community, the new development as a smart community from the ground up. Now, the interesting, for planning it for modelling purposes, the interesting thing about this is how do you model that? So we've got this planning permission for 500 houses, 1,000 jobs. The ambition is 3,000 houses. And we expect over the lifetime of a development, of a 3,000 unit development, the first phases are going to be different. So the first phases will probably look like a development we understand now. The last phases are much more towards what this video is trying to suggest. Is it an autonomous-driven, autonomous dominated environment? What do you do with the space you have that you don't need for parking? What are the opportunities around that? Now, how do you model that in and get that into a transport assessment and put it through a traditional planning process that we have now? That's a massive challenge, because one of the things potentially that comes out of that is a much reduced trip rate, which therefore they should have less Section 106, which we would want them to reinvest into smart technology in the development itself. But we have to have a reliable modelling tool to put that into the transport assessment for us to say, yes, we agree with that process and we agree with what your outcomes suggest. So that's a challenge, but it's something we're working with Cullum to look at how we develop that. It's also a massive challenge on boring things like road agreements. What do roads look like? Adoptions, all those exciting things that go with developments that I also get to manage. But it's also actually one of those areas we're not thinking about in autonomous vehicles very much at the moment. But it's something we need to start thinking about. I'll just leave on this. I've used this a few times, but I think it's good. In 1974, Oxfordshire was really innovative. We developed the first park and ride and introduced much cooler buses than you get now. That's the current bus. But this is 40 years later, and our innovation is still park and ride. This is how we discourage people from using the city centre. But what's really interesting, I think now, is the first time in a long time, possibly we will get to something completely different in 40 years' time. And that's just an image from a Minority Report, which was based in 2054, so that's why I like using that. But 5 years ago, you'd think that's ridiculous. I think a lot of it's still a bit ridiculous, but the point of autonomous on-demand vehicles is not so ridiculous anymore, and now I think we'd expect that to be happening in 2054. So I hope we've moved further on than another bus by 2054. And if anyone wants to contact us, we're very open for collaborations and working with partners, so please do get in touch.